We're going to move now into our first panel, which is Adjust Your Dial, Radio for the 21st Century. And to begin with, just a quick observation. When we talk about radio at Future Music Coalition, we really talk about the multiple definitions of that word. We do a lot of work around radio and terrestrial radio and thinking about radio in the context of this kind of highly regulated public resource that the FCC has a mandate to sort of govern on behalf of the public. And we look a lot at the rules and regulations and the laws that dictate sort of what happens in that marketplace and how it can reform terrestrial radio, both through the marketplace and also through getting the government more engaged. We also talk a lot about the radio as an art form and the idea that as we move to this new sort of structure of the music community, there is this need for filters, there are this need for recommenders, and that as an art form, radio in many ways is more vibrant than ever, and that there are new technology platforms for delivering radio-type services. So we really are very, very bullish on radio. We think radio is incredibly important. We think it's often underutilized, and we're hopeful that radio is going to be able to kind of recapture a lot of its magic as really a key component of the music community. What we've done today is we've tried to bring together a group representing a cross-section of individuals who work on different aspects, either on radio policy, in the radio industry, or in the music community where radio is really important or could be more important to the work that they do. I want to stress that, again, throughout the day what you're going to see is we're not going to be able to have sort of comprehensive debate on every single issue here. And we want these conferences to be very participatory, and we want to hear a lot from the audience and a lot of feedback, both in terms of questions, but also ideas, suggestions, talking back to panelists. This is really supposed to be a two-way conversation and not really just talking at folks. So with that introduction, what we're going to do to begin this panel is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their work, and share sort of their vision for if we take as a conceit that we have some blue sky, we have an opportunity to do some new things in this country. Where do you see the radio marketplace, or where do you see your personal relationship to radio or radio-type technologies in a couple of years? If everything comes together, what's your vision of success in a couple of years? And I'm going to start, I guess, closest to me, if that's all right, with Bryan Calhoun, who is the Vice President of New Media and External Affairs for SoundExchange. Bryan.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say thanks for having us out here. Very excited that the Future Music Coalition is doing events like this. I work for SoundExchange, which is the organization that collects digital performance royalties on behalf of sound recording copyright owners and performers. So for digital transmissions such as Sirius XM, cable radio, and so forth, we collect these royalties and distribute them. I think one of the things that we're looking at in terms of what's really important for us going forward, to answer your question, Michael, is the performance right being extended to terrestrial radio, which would require all the AM and FM radio stations to also pay a royalty to performers and sound recording copyright owners. So that's something we've been working very diligently on. And the bill was introduced last week that would make this happen. So I guess in my ideal world, that will go through and we'll be able to compensate performers for their works.
Thanks, Bryan. Parul Desai is Vice President of the Media Access Project. Parul.
Hi, I'm, as Michael said, with Media Access Project, which is a nonprofit law firm that for the past 35 years has been advocating for rules and policies that would open up the airways and make the airways more accessible to local communities, to local owners, and to make the airways more diverse. And for me, a more ideal radio marketplace would allow new voices to access the airways, diverse voices to access the airways, and for new entrants to access the spectrum. And I think this can be done in a number of ways, none of which are mutually exclusive. One way I think would be to open up the licensing process for low-power FM radio stations, which would serve local communities. They're smaller stations serving local communities, which would allow local artists to get on the airwaves, to allow local information to be broadcast on the airways, and to serve local communities. I think digital radio transition also presents opportunities. There's no set date for the transition, but the digital transition will provide extra capacity for incumbent broadcasters, and I think that provides some opportunities for new voices to access the airwaves. The FCC does have the authority to impose public interest obligations on broadcasters, and so ideas such as allowing new voices to access the airways, asking broadcasters to provide minimum levels of locally produced programming, independently produced programming. There's extra capacity that's being controlled by incumbent broadcasters, and I think the FCC does have the authority and should have the vision to allow new voices and an ability, such as local artists, the ability to access the additional spectrum. While LPFM and digital radio is a way for new voices and local artists to access currently available spectrum, I think there's also an opportunity now to open up new spectrum for new entrants and new voices. With the transition to digital television, this opens up television channels 5 and 6, which on the radio dial would be channels 76 to 88, and that can be opened up for FM radio broadcasting. I think that's a way to allow new entrants to access the airways, to have new owners on the airways, especially minorities and women who are underrepresented when it comes to ownership of the radio spectrum. And finally, I think it's still important to push back on efforts to repeal media ownership rules. While this may not open up new avenues for accessing the spectrum, I think it will help limit consolidation. It'll allow those broadcasters who are still independent broadcasters, even smaller broadcasters, who generally have more freedom to make their own programming choices. And so these are the types of stations that would be protected from consolidation and would have more vision to allow local artists and local talent to access the airwaves. That would be my vision for a perfect world.
Thanks, Parul. Next, I'm going to turn to Randy Hawke. Randy is the operations manager with Midwest Family Broadcasting. He's come in from Wisconsin. I just want to say how much I appreciate Randy coming, and it's really, we work very hard at FMC to make sure that the voices of the commercial broadcasters are included in our conversation, so I really appreciate you coming today, Randy. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for having me. I'm work for a company called Midwest Family Broadcasting in Madison, Wisconsin. I oversee operations on 4 radio stations: a Latino station, hip hop station, active rock station, and news talk station. Our company is family owned and operated for 50 years. Tom Walker is the 3rd generation Walker that runs. He's our local general manager, and he's also the president of the company in the 5 cities we operate in, which are Springfield, Illinois, Springfield, Missouri, La Crosse, Madison, and St. Joe, Michigan. It's the heart of the Midwest. It's America. Outside of here is not America. I don't know what this is, but it's not America.
DC, baby.
It scares me how not America DC is. Whenever I'm here, I'm like, oh my God, did these people leave here? Do they know that's not the way the world looks? And please tell me it's more than Dallas, which is not America, New York. I grew up in upstate New York. I decided when I was 7 or 8 years old to be on the radio. It's all I ever have wanted to do with my life. My brother can tell you when I was 9 years old, he was playing trucks and I was using his G.I. Joe turntable and my G.I. Joe turntable to play radio station. And he'll also tell you that was the year that I started my no request policy. So it is actually a birthright. It's not a mandate. To me, radio is an amazing art. It's all I've ever wanted to do with my life. And I'm proud every day that I get to do it, and I get to do what I love and feed my 5-year-old, my 3-year-old, and my lovely wife, Heidi. So thanks for having me. I know I'm kind of the enemy in the room, but hopefully I have some really good insight. I've never worked for a major company. I've always worked for independent broadcasters, but I've always competed pretty heavily against those, the bigger companies, and I have a pretty good perspective, both positive and negative, of being in a small company and what I see going on in the big companies. So hopefully I can offer you guys some good insight tonight. And I also have I think one of the best records in the industry for playing independent records and breaking bands. If you look up JJO's record, WJJO in Madison is easily the most progressive active rock station in the country. There's no day parting. Right now I have 6 indies or unsigned bands on my active rotation, ABC. Hopefully I've been told I speak a little too much radio, so if I use a term you guys don't know, just let me know and I'll explain it. But I'm looking forward to the panel today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Randy. Next is Peter Gordon. Peter is the president of Thirsty Ear, one of the great American independent record labels, and Peter's been our partner in crime for many years, collaborating on a variety of policy issues, particularly around the issue of access for independent music to commercial radio. Peter, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Randy, thanks for being the poster child here. This is great. We didn't know if we're going to have to tar and feather you. So thank you for that.
I do know karate. I would like everybody to know that.
I first fell in love with radio in the late 60s. I was in New Orleans and doing things I wasn't supposed to do, but mentally. But I listened to the radio, and my poor little mind just exploded on how exciting music could be. Then I got involved in the music industry and started releasing records. And radio was really a very warm and open place at that point. It didn't, and I don't mean Randy as they, but programming hadn't been figured out at that point. So it was pretty much a gut check situation. It was instinct, it was impulse, it was this sounds good, let's go do it. A very exciting time. And then the formula started coming forward, and I saw increasingly radio tightening and tightening and tightening. And it began to lead to a kind of a disconnect. It's kind of, we have the mauling of America, and then we had the mauling of radio, meaning it's a homogenization. And so you've got to look at radio and say, well, what's its role today? If you can go to any city in America and hear the same thing over and over again, except in Randy's towns, then is radio really accomplishing anything? And if you look at radio in terms of terrestrial radio, in terms of the digital age, it has a disadvantage. It's a blind medium, meaning it can't take advantage of listing playlists, album covers, social networking. It's non-interactive. So really, where does it belong in America? And what does it have that has a distinct advantage that makes it special to us in our lives? And the diamond in the rough is that radio, unlike webcasting or satellite delivery, lives in a community. And the community is a very vital force to tap into, to not only give it its place in life, but also to develop its cultural ecosystem. Its radio can present a wonderful place to encourage, to relate, and to both the musicians, the local scene, things that are really above and beyond radio just playing music or music that's squeezed in between commercials, which is what it's become. So if you look at radio in terms of looking at its role at that place, all of a sudden it has an advantage as opposed to a disadvantage. It has a place where you can go and you know that they live there, that the kid that's delivering on the messenger service he's got a band and he's got 27 friends and they've got 27 friends. And it gives it a very distinctive place, and it makes it a very compelling place, which leads to a greater business model, and a very interesting business model, because all of a sudden then the entrepreneurs in town and the local businesses want to work with that radio station because it's specific and it speaks the language of the town and the community. So if there is a vision for radio, which I'd like to see, and I've been working on with FMC, with a number of broadcasters, and maybe we can bring Randy into the fold. I'm trying to embarrass him as much as possible, so he has to do this.
Look at me. I've already done that to myself.
Okay, thank you. It's to really get involved, see where you live, relate to where you live, be a point of distinction, be a leader, and really be an activist for local culture. And I think that is possible, and I think that distinguishes radio then from anyone else, and it is their advantage today.
Thanks, Peter. Next, we have Bryan, Austin, Whitney. Bryan is the founder of Just Plain Folks, which now is up to how many people?
52,000.
52,000 independent songwriters and musicians who are all trying to figure out this very complicated new economy. Bryan, thanks for coming.
Thanks. As you said, I represent the organization, and our membership and our constituents are the people from the very entry level up to the 98% point that don't make it onto maybe a major label. Although we have maybe a few major label artists, it's basically that entire 98% that doesn't often have a voice, doesn't often have much organization to what their needs are. And their needs are so different than maybe that top 2% that a lot of times it's not as relevant. And for my community, radio represents sort of the point where their art that they make meets commerce, and where that opportunity for them to have a commercial, successful career actually comes together. And right now, on the internet is great. It's opened up a lot of opportunities, but it's such a mass amalgam of so many songs, so many artists, so many genres, so many levels of quality that it's almost impossible for you to stick out. You can be featured on the station on the internet and it doesn't mean anything because there's 5 people listening to that station. And so there's so many micro stations on the internet that they offer everything, but in some ways nothing. Whereas radio on terrestrial radio is the ultimate filter to say this is the stuff that sort of is where commerce happens. And so our members are worried about how they're going to get health insurance and how they're going to pay their babysitters thing, do a gig on Friday night, and getting radio play, especially in their local community, more important maybe even than national, is that helps them support their ability to have a career, even if they never get on the label and they never sell 1 million records. If they can build a 5,000 member fan base, they can make good money and have a career. So our view of radio is it's really that entry point for the artist community to get into the commercial side, since there's art and there's commerce, and that's really where it comes together for us. So we do definitely try to educate them on how it all works, and we try to be an advocate and a voice for that community to folks like the Future Music Coalition.
Thanks, Brian. And now I'd like to introduce Frannie Wellings. Frannie is Legislative Assistant for Senator Byron Dorgan. Many of you saw Senator Dorgan's keynote at our last policy summit in 2007. And Senator Dorgan has been a real hero for Future Music and our partner organizations around issues of media ownership, network neutrality, and a host of other issues. Frannie, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having me. I think that my boss, he sits on the Senate Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over many of these issues over the FCC. And I'm sure some of you have heard the story of a Minot train derailment and Clear Channel owning all the stations in town. And it's a disputed story by Clear Channel, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty. But generally, there was nobody there to alert the community about the emergency and what they should be doing. This was years ago, and I think my boss, while he had always had an interest in localism and the airwaves being public spectrum, belonging to the public, I think that really is one of the things that sort of made it a little bit more tangible. I think what he would look to in the next few years, I think, we're excited about the new administration. We're always excited about what we can do in Congress, and we're looking forward to having a different FCC, a very different FCC. I think he's looking to radio being more responsive to the community. I mean, it sounds like, and no, you're not the enemy. The commercial or non-commercial, there's responsive and there's not responsive. There's, we change the format and we don't care what anybody thinks. We're looking for more advertising dollars, or, our community wants to hear X. We hear stories all the time that is not happening, that people are upset because, and it generally is, the bigger radio stations are changing their formats or changing, we hear it both in the political terms of progressive radio versus conservative radio. We hear it in terms of going to sports instead of news or rock or whatever it may be. So I think, community responsiveness, localism, hearing local acts, local artists, local news, diversity of ownership, diversity of content, different approaches to technology, different uses of technology, the spectrum, obviously, low power FM radio. I mean, these are things that I think that we are looking to see differences in the coming years. We're hopeful, but obviously a lot of things need to happen. And more than anything, I think people need to be engaged, need to continue to be engaged, need to continue to be pushing on Congress and the FCC for what they want to see in radio over the coming years.
Thanks, Frannie.
Sure.
So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and sort of step back. And I spoke in my introduction about the need to sort of transition the conversation from being an oppositional sort of critiquing conversation into something that's actually doing something. And to give a little bit of context, as most of you know, the radio industry in the 90s was really struggling, and it continues to struggle, but it was really, there's a lot of the smaller broadcasters particularly were feeling a lot of economic pressure, and there was a sense in the industry that they really needed to ease some of the longstanding ownership rules in terms of who owned radio stations, how many you could own in a different community, to try to build more synergies and more economies of scale and make better use of new digital technologies and streamline management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think most people would grant that a certain level of consolidation would make some sense and build some, economic models that would make particularly smaller station groups more successful, more viable. The problem, of course, is what happened in 1996 is when Congress eliminated the national cap on how many stations any one company could own. And when then the local radio caps were lifted to 8 in any given market, in the largest markets, we had a complete revolution in ownership of radio. And, you all know the statistics, we've said them over and over again, but, the basic idea is you have 10 companies controlling 2/3 of listeners and revenues in the commercial space. In virtually every local market, 70% or more of the advertising revenue controlled by 4 companies or fewer. And rarely were those companies local companies. Typically, they're out-of-town chains. And then the emergence of sort of structural barriers that created a dynamic where over 80% of the music released in this country comes from the independent sector, but it's extraordinarily difficult to see those artists getting access to commercial airwaves. So what FMC did to try to sort of simplify this, because God knows this boy's simple, we started to talk about this in terms of a 4-part fixing radio agenda. Now what I'd like to do is kind of review that agenda and ask the panel to kind of weigh in on these different pieces, if they still feel relevant today, and how do we take it and move it from being a critique into something that you can actually do something about. And so the first piece of this agenda that we talked about, and again, we need to remember that as recently as, I guess, Frannie, probably 8 months ago, there was a very active push led by Clear Channel and some others to lift their ownership caps from 8 to 12 or even higher. So this is still part of the conversation. The first piece of this is hold the line on consolidation. And what we mean by that is really try to do what we can do, if anything, to get the government to facilitate getting back to local ownership and local control of these stations. So I'd first like to throw out to the group, is that still relevant? Hold the line on consolidation. Does that help? Is consolidation out of the bag? Are there policies that we can be thinking about to try to facilitate more local ownership and local control? Especially, most of you have seen the announcement that Clear Channel on the broadcasting side has basically come out and they've said they're going even further away from localism. They're going to more automation, more voice tracking, more syndicated programming. So I guess part of the question is, where now is the debate around consolidation? How does that connect to localism? And what, if anything, what is the connection between ownership of a station and then their connection to the community? And I'm just going to throw that open, and hopefully someone will take on pieces of that.
Well, I can
Parul, you want to
start.
go first?
Well, it is still relevant, and it's going to be relevant every 4 years. Congress has mandated the FCC to look at ownership rules every 4 years, and so this debate is going to come up every 4 years, and there's always going to be a push to roll back or repeal ownership regulations. So unless Congress says otherwise, I think this debate is always going to be relevant. It's always going to keep coming up. So I think to answer that question, it is still relevant, and we've been fighting for years to limit consolidation because we do think it affects what goes on in the local community. If you're hearing national playlists, you're not hearing local music. And I've seen this growing up. I grew up in New Jersey, and I remember hearing local hip hop, which when I went to the West Coast, I was surprised that I couldn't hear, Big E or Mary J. Blige. I was hearing Ice Cube. So there was a distinction between what I was hearing on the East Coast and the West Coast. Whereas now I can go anywhere in the country and still hear the same songs repeated. And I drive from DC to New Jersey all the time, and it's the same. In Philly, they play the same songs. In New York, they play the same songs. In DC, they play the same songs.
I would argue that is because the format became mass appeal. When you liked it when it was still East Coast and West Coast, I program a hip hop station. There still is a regional appeal to that, and we definitely look more to what's happening in the Midwest for us. But if you go to Chicago, Madison, St. Louis, Minneapolis, there's definitely a feel to those stations that you get from the region. But as a style or a genre of music becomes more mass appeal, it becomes more white bread. And, everybody, I would love to go back to when I was in college in 1988 and thinking I was doing the world a service by making sure everybody knew who the Replacements were. And a few years later, alternative rock became mass appeal. And now it's not even alternative rock anymore. It's just a mass appeal format. I don't know that we can turn the clock back on that. I'd love to know what the next alternative rock or hip hop or something like that is, but, you know, with the Seattle music movement, alternative radio as it was died, and you can't go back to that. And then after that, you know, Run DMC used to be really underground, and now they do reality shows from their mansions. So as something becomes more mass appeal and everybody knows it, whereas before, the East Coast, like you, weren't aware of what was going on the East Coast. And, you know, the other argument for that is, wow, now it's a global thing. Everybody knows East Coast and West Coast rap. For a while there, it was this big piece in coming of age, but the next step was, now it's a generic format that's all over. And, you know, now there's some really good more politically motivated, more responsible hip-hop movements that are coming up. Some of it was on the National Geographic video that still only has its slight regional appeal. I remember you saying you're from Atlanta. You know, that's a pretty important area, believe it or not, for what we look to for jams. We actually hired an imaging guy who works in Atlanta, and he really gives us a feel, because that's where some of the really cool stuff is coming out of, and the people in Madison wouldn't have access to that. Right. Did we not do that?
But, I mean, how did mass appeal happen? Mass appeal happened because the same formats were being played across the country.
The radio did not lead the way on mass appeal. Yo MTV Raps led for rap in particular, led the way for mass appeal on that.
In that genre, but I wonder sometimes, you know, do people want localism? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question.
It's a scary thing.
Do they want
it's
or do
truly
they
a scary
prefer the
thing,
world?
because, you know, we are a tiny company. I mean, St. Joe, Michigan, has anybody ever heard of it till I mentioned it today? Yeah, Whirlpool is actually world headquartered there. When I went to visit our market, I'm like, wow, there is something here. But it's really hard to say, you know, we do a local music show, we do a local music CD and things like that on JJO, and I mean, we're at remotes with a stack of local CDs out for free, and they don't grab them.
You can't take them.
They don't grab them. I mean, we can't put them in people's hands. And so I would be pretty scared if somebody said, hey, you have to play that on the radio. I'm like, I can't give it away. And it's not just JJO's format. There's blues on there and everything.
People are global consumers now. You know, people watch the 24-hour news channels for their news. They don't watch the local TV news anymore.
You couldn't get somebody under 35 to read a newspaper if your life depended on
Right,
it.
they want to be global citizens. They now can know what's going on in Africa. They now can know what's going on in St. Louis. And they want to know whatever the most interesting story of the current 30 seconds is till the next story comes up 30 seconds later. And I sometimes am concerned as somebody who tries to find a way for musicians to make a living in their own communities. Are people interested in what's going on in their own communities? And I think it's a valid question to ask. Sometimes I think we assume, because we advocate for people in those circumstances, we assume that of course people want localism. I'm not sure. I guess I'm opening that question up to the panel.
We as a company, and I know a lot of companies do this, we spend $36,000 a year on one study called a perceptual study that surveys thousands of people in our market, basically getting a feel for the entire radio landscape of Madison, asking them what they want, rating every single radio station that happens. It's done by a giant and very credible company, Coleman Research, in the Carolinas. And it's a humongous perceptual study. And we base so many decisions that we make off of that study. So it's hard for somebody to tell me, and you know what, a lot of our playlists, you know, JJO's #1 band is Metallica right now. Mm-hmm. You know, they just sold out a show there. The CD is selling like mad with I look at local sales, local downloads, local sales. We still have a great independent record store chain, the Exclusive Company in Wisconsin, and I talk to them all the time. And you know what? Our playlist looks just like, there's a certain chunk of our playlist that looks just like an active rock station in Boston, or an active rock, well, there isn't an active rock in New York or LA or DC, but you know, in real rock cities, 93X in Minneapolis used to be owned by Disney, you know, and our playlist looks real similar to those.
I want to bring Peter into this, but one of the sort of dynamics that we talk a lot about and we're trying to figure out and we do a lot of research around, we talk about these notions of structural payola. And we talk about what appears to us, and I think appears to a lot of people, as sort of structural barriers that are sort of built into particularly the consolidated radio marketplace. By way of illustration, you can take these bands that are independent record labels, which, and by no means is there this great sort of distinction that all major labels suck and all indie labels are great, but many indie labels work with a different business ethic, and many artists would prefer to stay in the independent community, especially the artists who have been benefited from the early investment from these independent labels and feel part of a community and part of a scene. And what we're seeing in the music economy, or at least what I'm seeing in the music economy, is that you have a whole host of bands that by any metric are extraordinarily successful in the marketplace. They're on Saturday Night Live, they're in our films, they're nominated for Academy Awards, they're all over advertising, they sell out rock shows. They're on the cover of Billboard. They're in the top 10. Andrew Bird sold, I think debuted at number 12 this week. I like the fact that the audience laughs at that. That makes me, but yeah, and it's crazy, right? When Obama has his special party for only his staff, who does he want? Well, he wants Jay-Z, but who else does they want? They want Arcade Fire, right? But these bands are virtually absent from commercial radio. So part of the question here is sort of the chicken and egg syndrome. Part of the question is, especially consolidated commercial radio, are they just completely irrelevant because of the barriers that have been put in place? And how do we break that cycle? I want Peter Gordon to speak to this because this is an area Peter's been doing a lot of work. But the questions of, how does the independent sector relate to commercial radio, particularly consolidated commercial radio, and how do we break that cycle, or do we just say, pox on your house, don't worry about it?
Thanks for that big challenge.
Yeah, you figure it out, Peter. Yeah.
That's a quick one, huh?
Yeah, that's a quick one.
Let's go and get the music queued up, because this is going to get really boring.
Cue the video.
There are a lot of issues. There's too many issues at play here, and I'm not going to blame Randy every time on this, though I'd like to.
I'm fine.
But it is his fault, and I've done a lot of work on the payola issue and tried to analyze it, try to understand its implications in the market, implications in terms of our own musical and cultural growth, why it exists, what it does. And there's a couple of things. One, radio needs to decide, do you want to drive the market, or does the market want to drive you? That's a fundamental question. And I think research is terrific, and call-out research is terrific, and it has its place. But music is alive, and it's in the air, and it can't be defined. Because it can't be defined, you have to use what was the old method of programming, which was your gut instinct. And I think that's primarily missing from that. And short of that, then you go into the shortcuts of how do you program. Well, you've got your trade magazines, and you start looking at what some of the major markets are leading with, and then therefore you want to go for those markets because that's a tested rotation for you. Or Metallica sells out, so that seems like a very good thing to play. And then you've created this barrier to entry, which are the promotion men that has this coveted place at radio. And in a way, it makes a lot of sense, because a radio station cannot deal with the thousands and thousands of labels out there, the millions of artists out there. They've got the guy, he gives them their spiel, he does the rotation in and out. But what that created was a financial barrier of access. It also created we talked a little bit about the bubble, but it creates a bubble at radio as to what they're listening to and what's considered good or bad because of these people that have gained this precious access. So in order for us to really look at the deeper, darker issues, we have to create a system of resources to bring forward this cultural richness that we have, which is tremendous, it's deep, but there isn't a bridge that's built between the artist community and the commercial community. It's a huge gulf. And until we can create this infrastructure and ability to properly channel what is the full palette, I don't think any station could possibly know what the potential is unless they've listened to all the cultural potential that's out there for them.
The problem I'm having right now I've heard your end of the argument with, one of the first things bands who aren't on the radio do is bring up research. But the radio stations can't be the bad guy on both sides of the argument. We can't be told to be local and find out what your local community does. launch these projects and find out this is what our local community wants, and then say, how come you're only playing this? We can't be the bad guy on both sides. Either we're trying to find out what our community's doing and achieving that, whether it's mass appeal or not, or we're driving the community and finding out stuff we want and feeding it to them. Because driving the community, which is one of the things that you mentioned, just mentioned, means we're doing what the big dark cloud of radio is. We're telling the community what they want. And then on the end of the table, we're not providing enough locals. So we can't be the bad guy on both sides. And I do agree, you know, now I'm probably gonna contradict myself. I agree. There's a spot, there needs to be a spot on playlists where you test people. You know, I know what my hip hop station's core sound is. And I know, hey, this band that no one's heard of fits that sound. These guys might like these guys. Let me throw it against the wall. Same thing with JJO. You know, there's a band out of Dallas called the Deaf Pedestrians. We led the way on them. They ended up getting, you know, and going to the major labels and the indie thing. You know, we led the way on them. A bunch of stations started picking them up. They got signed by Capitol Records. And, you know, we had an investment in that band. And the next thing you know, the CD never came out, you know? And it's just heartbreaking sometimes to invest all of that time in stuff and then watch, you know, you get on board with some of these indie guys and then they've abandoned us too, as much as radio's abandoned us.
Exactly, and you know, there's no, just like the economy, there's no single bullet theory
Right,
here
yeah.
that works, so we've got to get off that train entirely. But radio doesn't live in isolation.
Right.
You live in a support system with press, with retail, with the promoters. These are all your partners. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they are. And I would agree, you really have to have everyone working in concert for
Right.
you to be completely successful. And that, what I'm saying
and-
is, there isn't, excuse me just a second. There is, we would like to see kind of a lubrication of that relationship so that you could all talk about what you're trying to bring forward, because in today's world where it's completely oversaturated with information, you're overloaded. We're in an ADD world. We're in a multitasking world. Radio has gone from foreground to background, whether you like it or not. You listen to radio while you're doing 12 other things.
Yep.
And your challenge, of course, is to how do you go from background to foreground? So you have to marshal greater resources yourself. And part of the blame is the music community that we haven't built that bridge to you to say, look, there's all this great music here. You only have so much time to find it. Let's help you to find more of that music. Let's be partners and say, look, you think there is 1 through 10. We're going to show you 1 through 100. And maybe 99 and 97 is the one that makes your station pop. So I think we are as much to blame as you are. But what we need is this kind of healthy partnership that says, wait a minute. There's more to be done. There's more work to be done. We are on the same side of the fence. You have a tremendous influence in the community, which you should have. Let's make it bigger. Let's make it better. Let's make you unique. And then your whole business model just goes through the roof.
Right. And a little bit on the indie thing. I can tell you the exact point in my career where I decided that I needed an independent promoter. Is everybody familiar? An independent promoter is somebody that doesn't work for radio, doesn't work for records. They're kind of the liaison between. Elliot Spitzer got himself elected governor of New York through unique campaign financing going after independence. It's my opinion. The day that I decided, I was working at WAPL in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's a mainstream rock station in middle America. Columbia Records had John Mellencamp. They had 2 people in New York, 2 people in Chicago, 1 person in LA, all calling me, asking me if I'm going to play John Mellencamp at WAPL in Madison, Wisconsin. I think everybody in this room pretty much already knows WAPL in Madison, Wisconsin is going to play John Mellencamp. Then they went through and signed 11 independent promoters to work the John Mellencamp project. And a lot of times these guys work on a retainer fee like a lawyer. We're going to give you X amount of money to call as many radio stations as you can nonstop. Now, I have to do an air shift. I have to oversee everybody else that's on the air. I have to oversee all promotions, all production, and all contesting that the radio station does. I do not have time to take 15 calls a day on John Mellencamp. Now, if you are a radio person, you say, I'm only going to talk to one independent. You automatically eliminate 10 of those phone calls. And even at an average of 5 calls a day, that's an hour of my day of people calling me, talking to me about a record. Clearly, my mother, who's 80, knows I'm going to play. So the music industry kind of, I would argue that that issue was developed out of the music industry. And you know what? Those indies, the independent promoters work a lot of independent projects too, because there's some small indie labels that are backed by somebody with a lot of money, and they'll get really excited about a project and they'll throw a whole bunch of indies on it, and the same thing happens. And, you know, some of the independents will drive you crazy. You know, why are you calling me about a country record? I'm the hardest rock station in America. You know, and they don't focus. Like, so that goes to what you were saying, you know, a little bit more strategic on everybody's part would be great, understanding what a station gets done.
I'm curious, 2 questions. Why did you, first have to take those calls in the first place? Why are you obligated to take those calls? And
Well,
secondly, when you took the call, what is it that they're able to say to you that's going to get you to play it? I mean, what are they doing? They must be offering
Yeah.
something.
First of all, it was the mid-'90s, so I didn't have caller ID. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken those calls. Secondly, you try to have an open relationship. I mean,
But why do you need to have an open relationship with those particular people? You're programming your station, why do you have to have any connection with those people?
Just to be part of the music community, you want to know what's coming up. You know, that label isn't just made of John Mellencamp's. There's young and up-and-coming bands that they can bring to your attention as well. I mean, it's kind of the same reason I need to be here. I'm trying to interact with the whole music community. You know, I want to have a relationship with, whether it's Dot Point Period Records, you know, a little tiny two-band label, or Columbia Records, a giant conglomerate. I give them all the same amount of time.
Isn't it usually the point where that promoter calls to try to get somebody to add that song where payola takes place? Isn't that where that problem comes into
No,
effect?
payola takes
Because
place
they're trying to
when-
get you to play that. They're trying to do anything they can to get you to play that. Calling you on the phone and begging you doesn't seem like a very useful way to try to do that. So what is it that?
Payola takes place when 2 bad people are on the phone with each other. Anytime a law is broken, it's when 2 bad people that are willing to break the law are talking to each other.
Well, and I want to, take this back to a little bit of the policy debate, because what we see, or our feeling, is that, so what do we know? We know in 1996 there were some legal changes in law that directly led to, in a short period of years, a complete sort of revolution in ownership of radio. And we know that had a very disruptive impact to the industry itself, to Randy's competitors, to the way that artists would relate to the radio industry. And what we saw then is the FCC sort of chartered, and our belief is part of the FCC's job is then to look at this industry, say what in God's name is happening here? What's good, what's bad, what's neither, what do we have to get involved in, what do we not have to get involved in? And what we saw in certainly in 2002, 2003, was an FCC that came forward with a report that said, you know what, we've looked at this, and we can ascertain that consolidation has led to more diversity in the radio industry because now there are more formats. And, it was not a serious conversation about what the impact is in terms of localism, in terms of access to programmers, in terms of what's happening on playlists. And so my question to the panel is, there's going to be obviously a new FCC. We have interim, acting chairman Copps, who's going to be speaking with us today. We have sort of a dangling, ongoing discussion that was really teed up in the aftermath of the media ownership debates in 2003 around the question of what is the relationship between ownership and then a connection to the local community. So my question for the panel, and then we're going to engage the audience a little bit, but the question for the panel, A, in a digital age, does localism matter? Do we care? Should we care? B, is there a relationship between ownership and localism? And C, if there is sort of a relationship between localism and ownership, and if that can be documented, which the FCC has been doing for 5 years, so I kind of think it can be a little bit, what would you like to see the commission do? And what I think I'd like to do, Randy, is some other folks going to weigh in. What would be very helpful, Randy.
That's me getting the hook.
What I'd like to hear, what I'd like to hear from you, which would be really helpful, is if you hear policy proposals that come out from this group that would make it harder for you to succeed as a local entrepreneur trying to be a local broadcaster that is open to indie content, et cetera, et cetera? If you hear anything that's going to get in your way of succeeding, or is this really going to be stuff that's going to mess with your competitors and the conglomerates? So I don't know, Parul or Frannie, if either of you would be willing to step in on some of those questions?
I know some people in this room hate hearing this, but it is the public spectrum. And so, to me, there's always going to be the obligation of broadcasters to provide local communities with what is local information, local news, local artists. If there's a different model out there where broadcasters can do whatever they want, then localism doesn't matter. But the model is that the public spectrum belongs to the public. Broadcasters are trustees, and so they are required to provide local information, localism, local news, local programming, and hopefully local access for new artists and local artists. So unless the model changes, I think localism is still very relevant because the public deserves to get something in return for giving away that spectrum for free. So even in the digital age, localism matters, and I think it matters even more with the transition to digital. Again, as I said earlier, this is extra capacity that's going to be controlled and programmed by incumbent broadcasters. The extra capacity wasn't given to new entrants, so I think there's more of an obligation for broadcasters to provide something in return to the public. So I think localism is still really relevant, especially in the digital age.
I would say that, and I'll be short, every single radio station is measured by a company called Arbitron. The only way to perform in Arbitron is to get more people listening longer. And that's your own community. More people in your own community listening longer. That is the scale we're all judged on. And I think where it gets tricky is the definition of localism. I would tell you I'm being a local station by playing Metallica. Mm-hmm. I have a 40,000 person cume. 15,000 of them were at Metallica. Mm-hmm. I am informing them about that show. They clearly wanted to go. I think it gets a little tricky in the definition of localism.
Mm-hmm. Taking up on that, I think it's a major mistake to force localism on radio. At the same time, I think it's incredibly arrogant for radio to be dismissive of localism. So I think the middle ground is that we all have to be in the room, all of us that are responsible for media, and show how localism can work, and that's really our challenge. And once we can show that it works, then localism is no longer this policy we're fighting for. It's just a part of the fabric of America, and it doesn't have to be segmented. It is just what you hear on the radio. And because of that disconnect, we're having to have this discussion, but the end result is not to have it, but it's just mainstreamed with everything else, with Metallica and all the rest. So there's no point of distinction. It's just part of the palette of radio, and that's what we're looking for.
But, and to go back to a point that you made earlier, I don't think a lot of stations do this, but I think it is important to go into your community. You do the survey. I don't know what your survey looks like, but I don't hear a whole lot of stations saying, we go to our community, we ask them what they want to hear, and they want to hear Metallica. If that's what they want to hear, that's what they want to hear. But a lot of stations don't go into the community. They program what they want to program. They program what they think advertisers are going to pay for. But not a lot of stations are going into their community and asking, hey, what do you want to hear? And again, I don't know what your survey looks like.
I personally have never worked for a radio station that plays music for advertisers. I know what you're saying by then. You know, I work with sales managers. I have my whole career. And if sales managers programmed radio, it would be a very scary world, and Celine Dion would be the queen, because they seem to think making a radio station that appeals to 35 to 45-year-old women is the only type of radio that needs to exist. Programmers don't do that. I mean, I would also tell you, if Midwest Family Broadcasting only owned 2 stations in Madison, it would probably not be a hip-hop and a Latino, because those stations run on such a narrow profit margin that JJO and Magic 98 have to make a lot of money to kind of make sure we can take the risks that we do with some of those other stations.
Well, let me try to summarize at least, and I don't know, Frannie, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were going to jump in, but I mean, I think our feeling on commercial radio, Future Music's feeling for a long time has been commercial radio is going to make decisions based on commercial radio. I mean, they're going to make decisions based on what their business structures are. What we've been concerned about, can smaller, locally owned companies compete? You know, we lost lost fully 1/3 of radio station owners in the years immediately following 1996, where everybody just kind of consolidated, and it's very hard for folks like Randy's operation to stay and compete and work against these vertically integrated entertainment conglomerates. Kind of what we've been trying to strike the balance of, and I think we're really excited to kind of figure out as we move into this new political era, is how do you, on the one hand, understand the realities of the commercial marketplace, make sure you have regulations that allow locals to compete, allow transparency, make sure that artists aren't forced into the major label system and be forced to sign away their copyright as a prerequisite for even being considered for commercial airplay, all that. But at the same time, we basically say, look, commercial's commercial, business is business. As long as it's fair and transparent, they're going to do what they're going to do. But let's make sure that the non-com sector has the resources and the ability to succeed that they need. So I want to turn, I guess, to Parul to talk a little bit about the status of the Low Power Radio Initiative. That's an issue that's been very dear to our heart for a long time. And Frannie, if you could, actually, let me go to Frannie first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because legislation I know has gone through your committee in the last 3 Congresses that would lift the ban that Congress placed on the FCC from allowing the FCC to issue 100-watt non-commercial radio licenses in urban markets. I don't know if you have any sense of where that is this year.
Sure. I think, Congress messed this up, and so Congress has to fix it. Congress commissioned a study to find that there wouldn't be interference, and the study came out with the conclusion that there wouldn't be interference, and we still have not moved this bill and opened this up to low power FM. So we last year passed it through the Senate Commerce Committee, and then it didn't get any further. I think, I think we probably say this every year, but I think this is the year that we actually get LPFM passed through the Congress. I think that Senator Cantwell is looking to introduce it quite soon. And we could probably, the Commerce Committee is going to be full of nominations for nominations and the DTV transition for a little while. Once we get past that, I think we'll start marking up bills, probably a lot of bills that we've already passed through the committee in previous sessions. So that would be a very good one to start with. And, I think everybody who's realistic agrees that we're beyond the controversy of this. Everybody knows that it's the case. And if the broadcasters are going to keep pushing back on it, well, they're just going to lose. So I think that the bill will go through the Commerce Committee, and then we'll, look to find a vehicle to get it through. It's very difficult. I'm sure many of you know it's very difficult to pass a bill in the Senate because it's, you have to have unanimous consent or you need floor time, and it's extremely difficult to get floor time for a bill. So I think that we will find a way to get it through the session. I don't think that the strength is there on the other side of the issue, and I think the movement is with low power FM right now. So I think we have some confidence that it'll move along.
If it passes, can you tell us what does that actually mean?
Well,
What happens then?
I think you guys might be able to tell, Parul might be able to tell how many more low power FM stations you think would be able to get on the air in communities across the country.
I don't have an exact number off the top of my head, but it would help in opening up some spectrum in urban areas. There really isn't an issue in rural areas because the spectrum's there, it's open, and it's not as congested. There's some things that have to happen at the FCC that would allow for more availability in urban areas, but the hope is to at least open up some availability in urban areas where you could have these small local radio stations. The issue isn't so much in rural areas, it's really more in urban areas. And what the legislation did was it prevented the FCC from licensing on a certain 3 channels away, basically, from a full power station or from a station that already exists. So we're forced to kind of go further out, and in more congested areas, the availability just isn't there. So lifting the legislation will at least help to open up some opportunities. It may not be the windfall that we want, but it'll be it's better than what we have right now.
I don't really have a ton of experience in the low power thing. I know that our 106.7 signal and our 93.1 signal that both were new add-ons since I've got to the company. You really don't know what those signals are going to do till you turn them on, especially in an urban area. I mean, there's a lot of buildings for things to bounce off of and not cut through and things like that. So I can't comment other than to know if it passes and they turn these on, that's really going to be the only way. I mean, we commissioned so many studies to find out how the 106.7 signal was going to react to this hill and the Capitol building and all that. And
Well,
it's
Congress
really tough to
mandated the
figure it out.
FCC to do a study, to
Right.
study whether or not there's going to be interference if you're 3 clicks away. And the study basically said, there's very minimal to almost no interference. And so you spent, taxpayers spent millions of dollars on the study to show what the FCC had already said, that there was very little interference.
Right, and there's a small broadcaster, Good Karma. It is a small broadcaster. It's the son of Mel Karmazan, but it's a little guy. It's a little guy running 2 really small stations in Madison. He moved his 100.5 signal to the top of a water tower, and 101.5, which is actually my rock competitor, is getting destroyed by it. It's 100.5 and 101.5, and nobody saw that coming. Personally, I'm pretty fine with them not figuring it out for a while, but you don't really know what could happen one way or the other till that stuff's on.
Well, I think that, the big issue, and I think what people need to the way we think about it is, again, you had a situation in the late 90s where you had massive consolidation in this space, and, sort of the industry united around a certain business model, a certain, business philosophy as far as how you define localism, how you identify your audience, how you sort of carve up demographics to give that specific demographic what you think they're going to want, and how you kind of turn that into an advertising model. And in the case of a company like Clear Channel, how you then integrate that with your other properties like billboards, et cetera. Again, that's a business path that they went down that road, and we had problems with it, and we talk about it endlessly, The other point, though, is that you have unused spectrum. You have gaps on the radio dial where the engineers at the FCC say there's absolutely no reason from a technical standpoint that you can't put a 10-watt or 100-watt radio station in between existing stations. And there's this absolutely phenomenal unmet demand of schools, churches, community organizations, arts organizations, local governments who would die to have an opportunity to do this. And part of the disconnect is I think, there's some, I'm not saying this is Randy, but there's some in the commercial space who would say, why would they want this station, or it's going to fail, or there's no business for this, or there's no market for it. But, Randy came out of college radio. I mean, people who, have come out of the community scene know there are a lot of reasons to broadcast, that go beyond the economics of it. There are a lot of reasons to want to do this, to create a platform for art, for political discussion, for local comment, for organizing. There are a lot of reasons to do it. And the idea that the federal government would essentially have a policy of not allowing those local stations to be licensed is just, flabbergasting. So what happened in '99 is the commission created this new platform for LPFM. The Congress, as Frannie said, stepped in and said, we've heard concerns from commercial broadcasters, we've heard concerns from others that the technology may not work. We're concerned that the engineers at the FCC move the process too quickly. We want to make sure this thing's going to work, which is what the study was. So the study was submitted in 2003. It's 5 years later. There are hundreds of groups ready to go to get these stations. The commercial radio industry is, really in some disarray at this point in terms of the future of the industry. We think very strongly that it's time for the radio broadcasters and people who care about FM radio and love FM radio and think it's important to really get on the same page and say, more than anything, the competitors to FM radio are not the community stations or the commercial stations. The real competition are the other platforms and other formats. And as we have generations of consumers and music fans growing up on the web, on satellite, not feeling the connection that people my age felt to radio, it's really time to get everybody who really wants to create compelling, interesting, live and local programming. They're all on the same team. So hopefully we'll pass this bill this year. We'll get that thing done and we'll move on. We're talking way too damn much. Do we have any questions? I'm sorry, we have a lot of time. Ann Chadovitz, Executive Director, Future Music Coalition in the house. Let's hear it.
I just have one question for you, Randy, because I really understood your reasoning for hiring the independent promoter, the 15 calls from Columbia a day about John Mellencamp. But I'd like to know, what was your payment relationship with the independent? I mean, you were hiring him to deal with this mess, so you didn't have to. Did he pay you? Did you pay him? Did he have to warranty? That's the first question. The second question is, did he guarantee you that he would be open to everybody and would agree to recommend things whether or not they paid him a fee?
Well, first of all, I was in a non-exclusive deal with him, which is the thing that keeps you from that. Secondly, no, I didn't pay him, and no, he didn't pay me. Like I said, two bad people are two bad people.
Yep.
A radio person that wants to, a person in any sort of, a person in a position where somebody else wants something from them, it all depends on how bad that person wants something from the other person as to how low they'll go. I personally would never, ever cross that line. I'm too much of a radio purist. Like I said, I started at a non-commercial station in Erie, Pennsylvania, trying to play this really cool music that was breaking out of Minneapolis, in Erie, Pennsylvania. So, the bad people, you just have to look at my TV. My wife literally fears that it's going to tip over on my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old. It's 10 years old. It's gigantic behind the screen. You know, I've never gotten a TV or anything to play a song on the radio. Some of the stories that were coming out made myself and some of the other program directors drop our jaws and go, "They what?" You know, that was, you know, a black eye in the industry, but I think radio deals with a lot of generalizations. You know, that train accident was horrible, where irresponsible local people, there's local people that run those stations that made bad decisions. They could have made those bad decisions whether they were owned by a giant company or a small company.
Hang on. There were 5 stations that had 1 employee, 1 phone line, because they're all 5 stations were
Right,
owned by one
but
company.
it's- but-
So if you have a diversity of companies, then you have a diversity
Right.
of
But
people.
somehow it got down to the point where there was only one. There was a lot of bad decisions that left. I personally would be mortified by any of that. We have a news department, that a local news department with 6 employees and reporters and everything, and it's an expense. But I unfortunately, bad people do bad things, and it doesn't mean that all of us do that.
Other questions?
My name is Chris Naum. I work for a local media company, but my question is directed toward Randy. It's basically your research. Sorry. The research you said was conducted through, I guess, music stores and, you know, polling people in your local communities. And you said Metallica was the #1 record being sold because it can't be sold through, I have a feeling it's not sold, a lot of their stuff is not sold on iTunes. Is it still correct?
No,
You can't-
they're everywhere.
Okay, well,
They're everywhere.
are you considering what people are buying online, what people are buying, what people are listening
Oh,
to?
yeah, we have
and-
Big Champagne and other resources that tell us exactly what people are buying online. And you know what, I eliminated bio pages on my websites and told all of my staff that they have to have a Facebook or a MySpace page and keep in touch with everything. We try to keep as much in tune. I want to know. I can tell you a list of bands that JJO's helped start their career. And we pride ourselves in that. We pride that, you know, I go to civic events. The Taste of Madison is on the Capitol lawn, and I have a hard rock stage and a hip hop stage. And you have no idea how many city meetings I have to go to keep those 2 stages there. And that's not radio driving. And keep in mind, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. As we speak, there's probably somebody smoking a joint on the Capitol steps. And I have a hard time keeping a hip hop stage on the Taste of Madison.
I'm just gonna say something from my
Don't
personal
worry,
experience.
man, I can handle
No, I lived in Atlanta for a couple years, and I can't remember the name of the station. There was a great station that always played on Sundays, had an hour of, you know, the DJ programmed, you know, his own blues that he thought was interesting, his own bluegrass, you know, stuff that wasn't being played on radio station. People listened to the station because it was original. People were playing original stuff, and it was getting lots of listeners because it was this original, you know, this DJ was doing something that wasn't happening on the other stations, and he was pulling in high numbers. So, you know, maybe that idea of experimenting with new music can bring in the listeners, the ears.
Question in the back.
You know, Randy, yeah, as you said, Washington D.C. isn't the real world. You're not the real world for radio, I don't think either. So I think you got to sort of put it in perspective. I don't think you're the typical guy.
I think that, you know, unfortunately, in the bigger cities, companies like mine don't exist, but I brought the WBA directory. I can tell you about ownership in Wisconsin, and anybody can flip through this. you're only going to find 5 of those giant companies in the entire state. When you get into the Midwest states, there's really only 1 or 2 metropolitan cities in the entire state. And the model where Clear Channel owned all of these smaller markets and things like that, it failed for them. They're trying to sell them off really fast.
Right.
They couldn't do it. Their model failed. I competed against them in Milwaukee when I was on an independent. Willie Davis owns it, minority owner, gigantic man. He was a Green Bay Packer, NFL Hall of Famer. You ever see the famous picture of Vince Lombardi getting carried off the field on his shoulder? That's number 87, Willie Davis. He's an amazing radio owner. So I worked for him in Milwaukee. At the time, I'm telling you, Clear Channel owned the majority of radio stations in Milwaukee. They owned the concert promoter. They had the control of 2 amphitheaters. They owned what was SFX, which became Live Nation at the time. We're just like, how are we going to do a rock station against these guys? They were never easier to beat. They even owned the Billboard company, and our main primary source of advertising Rock 102.1 was billboards, and they couldn't even communicate with each other to the point where our secret billboard campaign that was in their building, the radio never found out about it. I mean, that model of what they tried really failed, and they spun a lot of that stuff off, and believe me, they're still in Wisconsin and Eau Claire, and they'll take anybody's offer right now to try to get out of that market. That model of just trying to homogenize everything failed.
Frannie, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can say that, and I think it's definitely the case in North Dakota that they came in, bought everything, and then tried to sell. But generally, they have been, coming around the hills, still arguing for further consolidation. So, you look at the XM Sirius merger, and the argument was constantly financially we need to merge, and they've merged, and now they're possibly filing for bankruptcy. I mean, I think that in the economy, with the economy the way that it is, I would have a heightened concern for consolidation, and maybe not in rural areas, maybe not in the Midwest, but I still think it's just as much of a concern, and their argument is going to be, this has to be immediate, we're going to crumble if we don't do this, and yet the financial thing is never, I don't think it has any, strong
Well,
footing.
and I think when you talk specifically about the experience of Clear Channel, I mean, part of what was so interesting about that experiment was that it was an experiment. That basically it feels like very few people thought that a company would try to create something of that scale, to go from 40 to 1,240 in a period of, 5 or 6 years. And that put our sense is that put enormous strain on every aspect of the music community. My belief, and Randy, I don't want to talk out of turn, my belief is it put a lot of strain on radio professionals. We have many friends who wanted to work in the industry, but then when Clear Channel and 1 or 2 others became the only game in town, particularly in the larger markets, it really, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people had to move into different careers. For the music community, a number of artists, again, felt squeezed, and they felt like they had to play the game if they wanted a chance to get into the pipeline. You had the whole, kind of brouhaha related to, their attempts to integrate, the promotion arm with the live entertainment arm, with the playlists. You had all this stuff which is just really screwed up. And I guess the other piece I don't want to lose on this for policymakers is that, radio is important, and we want to fix radio. We want to do what we can to reform radio and sort of recapture, its standing that we think it should have as sort of, the most vibrant and important platforms for speech and for a culture. But we also need policymakers to understand there's a test case here. There's a period where they took an incredibly important, ubiquitous technology that all Americans listen to at some level, where they allowed the industry to come in with a plan to completely revolutionize ownership of this industry, to try some new business scheme that would sort of be a whole new way of monetizing, these radio licenses, and it failed. It failed, and we should have known better, and policymakers should have been engaged in this a lot better. We have a question in the back.
Hi, my name is Jack Scher, and I have sort of a question for the panel about localism and diversity, which is this. We're sort of in a catch-22 situation because we don't know whether or not people in local communities don't want to listen to local artists, which I don't assume is the case, or whether or not the fact that they're not interested in listening to local artists because all they hear is these national syndicated playlists. So my question is, we don't want to hurt the smaller broadcasters. Is there a way to sort of pass a piece of legislation which would incentivize national broadcasters like Clear Channel to pay more attention to local artists and local concerns without also at the same time hamstringing the smaller broadcasters? And is there a way to do that without violating the Constitution?
It's an easy one. Go ahead, Brian.
I would just, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question. I apologize if I get it wrong, but it seems to me that you could make the case to some stations, especially ones that are failing and nothing they're doing is working, that if they can go back and recreate the culture of the towns that they have the stations in and become identifiable with the sound of that town. If you think about the sound of Philadelphia or Detroit or New Orleans or name whatever city you want, I have to wonder that if you took on localism from that perspective, not just the current artists that live in that town, but historically, what artists have been important to that town and what kind of music did they make, and can you be that face, that radio station be that public face of bringing that cultural combination of music and the local community back together? I think that is an approach that might be something to try, especially if they're flailing and they're failing. Looks like you wanted to jump in on that, but
I'm trying not to dominate, but I mean, I think somebody mentioned, I think you mentioned earlier, the chicken and the egg, it's like what comes first, good local, some people would argue, the only reason people don't know local music exists is because radio isn't playing it, and we could say the only reason radio's not playing it is because local music isn't that good right now in our particular market. I mean, we can't make a blanket assumption that everybody that picks up a guitar is a decent local band.
no, but I think the key is that there has to be some methodology that the people who are picking the playlist are making the decision based on what is the best music, regardless of where it comes from.
Right, and
And I
every
don't know that
station-
we can feel confident. Maybe in your case, it sounds like it probably happens that way.
First of all,
But
I
know
have
it does happen that way
these,
everywhere else.
this cloud of a giant nationally syndicated playlist that we all work from. It doesn't exist. I can tell you right now, I have no giant nationally syndicated list. There are charts in trade magazines. That dates back to way, way before consolidation. But I don't really use charts. I don't.
How much local music are you allowed to, is there anybody in your
There's nobody
organization
mandating
that filters through
what
that
I
at all?
play at all. And I can tell you that I've never been in a situation where I've been mandated on what I play. I have a core sound in my station that I have to appeal to.
Yeah.
Can a local artist in that genre walk into your station
Luna
and say, here's my
Mortis,
CD?
Luna Mortis, a local band in Madison that plays our style of music, actually just got signed to Century Media out of Madison.
So can I
if I
just take
could-
a step
Parul,
back?
yeah, good.
I just want to take one step back. I think one of the issues of who gets on the air and who has opportunities, one of the problems is consolidation. There's no competition, so there's stations aren't competing with each other to figure out what the audience wants to hear. If you have one owner that owns 2, 3, 4 stations and that's controlling the content, there's less competition and there's less of this testing the market to see what people really want to hear. So there's less competition. You don't really get different voices. You don't get different ideas of what you may want to program. So I think that is one issue. And because of that, I think there's more of a focus, like Michael said, on community broadcasting. That's why LPFMs are fighting to get on the air, because they think they can fill a need. That's why non-commercials are trying to get access to the spectrum, because they think they can fill a need that the community wants. So there's the issue of consolidation. There's no one's competing against each other. So there's no testing of what people want and what they don't want. And that's why now you're seeing more of a push for non-commercial entities to get on the air.
Don't forget, we're also talking about these things that are missing and these local people getting involved in stuff in the absolute purest form. People who, public access TV was designed in the same way. And you know what? There's neo-Nazis and everybody that get their time on those. It's not just a platform for local music.
Right, but that's the point of diversity. We're not saying one crowd should be dominant over another crowd. The point is we want more voices, and then people can have the opportunity to get what they want. If you have more voices, you have more competition, you have more ideas out there, and there may be one set of people who like, neoconservative talk, and there may be people who want local hip hop or local shows,
Yeah,
but there's just not enough
I think, Frannie wants to jump in.
competition.
I mean, again, I don't want to reiterate this point, but again, it's great to have Randy here, but it's also, we're having a straw man debate because, Randy, you don't represent
Exactly.
a typical broadcast entity that a lot of folks are dealing with, because a lot of things
But
we're talking about are.
I know that's come up several times, but
Yeah.
in Milwaukee, I competed against Journal, Saga,
But
Clear
what I
Channel,
mean, Randy,
as an
is-
independent
is-
broadcaster, and to say there was no competition in that market
No,
is
No, no, that's-
is
No,
absurd.
but to say that you don't use playlists and you don't have, I mean, you're a different radio station. I mean, Madison is very different. DC is different from the rest of the country. Madison is also very different from the rest of the country. I think that you're.
I'm speaking for all 5 of my markets.
Okay, but what you're doing is clearly different, right? And you're not Clear Channel, but voice tracking goes on across the country.
Voice tracking has to go on. You don't understand. My hip hop stations,
No, it
my
doesn't.
hip hop station makes $300,000 a year. Think about that. If I had to employ at a living wage $40,000 before I pay their benefits, 6 people on 4-hour shifts, that's just the programming people. I haven't paid anybody else. You have to be very aware of the model. Radio stations are not running around with giant wheelbarrows of money. That is not the reality that we live
Nobody's
in.
saying
And I'm
that they
telling you
are.
right now, some of these things that are being talked about, whether it's performance royalties or people being mandates that we have to have somebody on the air on every station 24 hours a day, will not destroy the Celine Dion stations.
Right.
They will destroy the Latino stations. They will destroy the hip hop stations. They will destroy these stations that operate on a very, very tight cash flow basis and simply cannot exist. And trust me, if the advertising community and the public embraced them, they would simply make more money.
All right.
That's how it works. There's no scam here. We sell advertising that appeals to our market. Those people go to our clients and spend their money. If we don't draw people in the same way the newspaper, the same way the television,
Okay,
the
okay,
same
okay,
way
okay.
banner
Right,
ads, and the same way bus sides do, then they just simply will go buy bus sides or those ads in the urinals instead of us.
Okay,
We
first
have
of
to
all-
live in
Yeah,
that
Frannie,
world.
go ahead, and then, I don't know if we can keep going, but go ahead,
Okay,
Frannie.
first of all, I have to defend public access television, because there are really good
I'm
people
all-
that do
I'm
public
on
access
pro
television.
public access
And-
television.
and Madison's got great people. Second of all, I can give you an example of how competition and consolidation really does make a difference. In North Dakota, there are 2 companies in one city that owned, I think one owned 3 and one owned 3 but was able to operate the 4th. And there was, it was sort of, I think maybe a 2-year battle over that 4th, because the one who had the 3 was extremely unhappy that the other one would use their 4th one to try and change their format, and they would have to follow what this 4th did, and because they had this extra station, they were always sort of trying to play catch up with what the 4th one did. It's just, this kind of stuff is insane, but this is what happens when you have consolidation and you're trying to meet the limits, the strict limits, right, of how many stations one company can own. And so if if you raise that limit, I would say if we don't lower that limit, then these are the games that we play, and the competition.
I'd be really scared about how many minority and radio stations and niche format stations would go away if consolidation numbers were
I
lowered.
think there are, Free Press and Future Music Coalition have done some great studies on minority radio stations and the impact of consolidation, and then what
Well,
happens.
I'm telling you right now, I program a Latino station and a hip-hop station, and if Midwest Family gets consolidated down to 2, those are not the 2 that are gonna be left.
Well-
I'm just being honest with you.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
I just
mean,
wanted, I
think-
just want to add a
think
point
that's-
real quick too, is that I know you mentioned the performance right, but there are accommodations in the bill that would give significant discounts to stations like yours that do $300,000.
No, it wouldn't, because JJO makes $2 million a year. So we would not apply to the 5,000. And a lot of radio stations in small markets make more than the 1.25 mil. But you know what, though, because JJO makes a little bit more, we're able to put the other 2 stations on. It works like one giant machine together, It's really tough. And, our Latino station is one of the most amazing stations in the city. It's one of the coolest things I ever got to work with, because it's the main source for that community. They have a 1-hour talk segment, and then they have a merengue hour and a regional Mexican hour, and it's really radio back from when you were talking about, like just trying to appeal to whatever the community can do. But, a station has 4 employees, The payroll is almost $200,000. The station bills $400,000. The programming payroll is almost $200,000. The station bills $400,000. 15% commission on salespeople, you gotta take that off the top of that 4. I mean, you're talking about really tight things. We haven't even paid the transmitter bill. If anybody wants that transmitter plugged into their house for a day, we'll gladly run the extension cord. That stuff's expensive.
Question,
Michael,
Michael?
oh, sorry.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I work in DC with local artists. And DC is truly an anomaly for what I know of radio stations and trying to get played locally. Personally, I know pretty much every single DJ at one of these radio stations. Every single DJ says, oh, we love this song. So at DJ meetings, they say, we want to play this track on the radio. Yet when it gets put to the music director, not really feeling it. So there's even disconnects in radio stations out here that don't listen to what their DJs are telling them, because their DJs are in the communities. I see their DJs nearly every single night. And so, your radio station will go to Atlanta, will go to New York, go to Philly, will go to all these other areas that are embracing what their local talent has. And DC, for what I know, doesn't do that. And I don't know.
But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That's where I get really worried about applying generalizations or certain things that have gone wrong to everybody. I mean, look at the banking industry right now. There's some banks that are healthy and did things right. There's some banks that did things wrong. Now, if we start treating everybody like the people that did things wrong, it's not really fair. That's why I refuse to go to gas stations that make me pay credit card, because I've never driven off and not paid for my gas. I don't like being treated like a criminal because somebody else is a criminal. I'm not saying you are. No, but yeah. Right. But no, I agree with you. And it's so hard. I mean, I grew up in Rochester, New York. And New York has a really weird dynamic about it, politically and culturally, because there are 5 or 6 major cities in New York. But one of them is New York. And I mean, this isn't a slag on her at all. But New York City elected a woman from Arkansas to represent us. Local to New York is the world. But local to Rochester, where Kodak, Xerox, and Bausch & Lomb are going broke, is not. So, I mean, it's tough to define local. It really is hard. And these bigger metropolitan cities, local to them is completely different than local elsewhere. I mean,
if we can pull back just a second.
Please.
I mean, we're flip-flopping between the concept of consolidation and localism. And I think the larger question is, does consolidation and localism, can they coexist? And is one at the exclusion of the other? And the biggest problem we really have is defining what the hell is localism. And in fact,
Yeah, I
how
guess
do you
that's-
implement localism? And until we can really define that, we really can't move forward on this discussion, because Randy has a particular view of it, and a successful one, but you could put 10 programmers in here, and you're gonna get 10 opinions. So if you ask, and you go back, sorry, Michael, to your original question on a policy issue, if we have dysfunction in the market, then it's time for the FCC to step in. These two don't coexist. They should coexist. Therefore, let us try to define what is localism. Let us try to define an implementation of localism that we could all agree on, and then we will really have a full palette of voices in the marketplace. But until we can step back and define it, then we will have these discussions until tomorrow, until 10 years from now. We've got to just step back and say, this is it, how do we do it?
We have time for 2 more questions. Go ahead, back here.
Hi, my name is Lance Reynolds. I'm a bit of a veteran. I started as a hip-hop DJ, moved on and worked in major market radio here in Washington, D.C. as a promotions director. I've also worked on the air at XM Satellite Radio. So my real question is, I don't believe that, well, I'd like to say this first. I don't believe that radio it's a very narrow pipeline. I don't think that pipeline is necessarily the place where independent music is going to find its footing, and you'll have some stories that come out of it that are success stories. But my question is, what is being done to empower broadcast entrepreneurs? I think this question is for SoundExchange. If say I'm a broadcast entrepreneur and I want to take on, say, a radio, or I want to just play the sound that I want to play, it's very prohibitive to do that online. What about the cost of broadcasting music, generally speaking, versus, say, trying to get radio to do this other thing, which I don't believe it's going to do? I think that radio has reacted to video playlists, and that's pretty much what they've followed since, since the late 90s, since the Biggie era moving forward, at least in hip-hop. So my question is, what do you see coming in terms of how to empower broadcast entrepreneurs to broadcast this music and be profitable doing so?
Well, I don't think that it is cost prohibitive. I mean, you have to pay for the content that's going to be drawing your crowd. And I think that SoundExchange has been doing a great job in ongoing negotiations to make sure that the rates are going to be something that will work. But I think some of the complaints have been coming from people who haven't been able to effectively monetize their business. So that's why maybe the percentage of what the royalty rates are appear to be high. It's because they haven't necessarily monetized their business as well.
I think just to add to that, radio had that advantage, distinct advantage of not having to pay that.
Right.
So I think that perhaps something needs to be done to look at that sort of setup, not necessarily taking it completely away, not paying artists at all, but just maybe looking at something that empowers broadcast like radio was.
Radio pays artists, by the way. Radio pays artists.
They pay writers.
They pay songwriters.
They pay songwriters, but they don't pay the performers, the sound recording copyright
Now,
owners.
we pay for our music. It's just not paid the way everybody wants it paid. There's a huge expense, $65,000 a year on JJO. So it makes me cringe when I say we're getting our music for free. We're paying writers $65,000.
But there are also performers who don't write their material who
Right.
who don't get paid. I mean, and the United States is the only developed nation that doesn't pay the performers and sound recording copyright owners for that.
Most other nations have content where the government dictates what songs get played too. And that's kind of the
Yeah,
Brooklyn Bridge.
if you're in a band, I know somebody who's in a band that had the #1 song in the world. The drummer for that band, between tour stops of headlining at Woodstock, had to make sure he got home so he could continue giving drum lessons so he could pay his rent, whereas the songwriter of the song that they had that was #1 in the world was buying his house in Beverly Hills. Because there was no income for him as a band member of the #1 song in the
I'm
world.
not saying that I'm not saying that the money we pay is properly distributed.
Well,
I'm just
no,
saying
wait a
we
minute.
pay.
No, wait a minute. And not only that, but we lose all the income worldwide. So they lost all their income worldwide because everybody else in retribution, because we don't pay their artists here for performances, keeps that money, and our artists don't get paid over there either.
Right,
So here's
like
a
I
guy
said,
in the
I don't-
#1 band in the world who
I-
can't pay his rent.
I'm not going to say I agree with how the money's distributed.
Yeah.
I'm just saying we're paying it.
I hear Randy's point. We're going to do a quick question, and then we're going to wrap up, then we're going to break.
Hi, my name's Tim Anderson. I'm from Old Dominion University. My question is about low per FM. I drive around the country like y'all do, and I listen to the left hand of the dial, that 10%. And if we all remember our radio history, if anyone does, that was put there for a lot of local stations, a lot of news stations, but they all became NPR and church stations. And one of the things that worries me about the low power FM, while I'm a big advocate, is that these licenses would go to a group or an organization, and they would remain there and become sort of de facto property that doesn't recirculate when we say you're no longer in the local's interest. So what kind of guarantees are you going to place that allows that low power FM doesn't turn into what the left-handed dials become, which is basically NPR's territory? And I love NPR, but if you want local, don't listen to NPR. Listen to Sports Talk Radio, which is all about your local teams. It's the only place I find local on the AM dial.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I'm going to take that because we're almost out of time, if that's all right. I mean, what I can say is that I think people who are supporting the Low Power FM initiative absolutely understand those concerns. And the whole point of trying to create this initiative is trying to create a platform for local voices. There's a very complicated point system associated with licensing LPFM that's connected to local programming, who's on your board. I mean, basically, the commission is working very, very hard to make sure that this is really meant for local service for groups that feel like they don't have alternate platforms. It's tricky to implement, and there are a lot of concerns about sort of, how do you manage a station over a period of years, but they're definitely into that. I want to wrap with one quick framing thought, and I promise I'll be quick. We talk a lot about chicken and egg, and we talk about what are we going to do to address these questions of localism, address these questions of the transformation of the commercial space. How do we really address some of these structural barriers? And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at FMC is that as we talk about all these different policy areas, we really want to get beyond this notion of silos, that you talk about radio policy over here, you talk about broadband policy here, you talk about copyright here, and obviously that's the way we've organized the day, just because that's the only way we can organize a conference. But really what we're thinking a lot about is trying to reframe these policy discussions around the question of what does it take to create what we call a local sustainable cultural community. to not talk about DC down, talk about community up. What are the tools that you need for culture to thrive locally, for artists to have the tools they need, for all the interconnected businesses that make up the music community, including retail, labels, performance venues, et cetera? What do you need on a local basis to have the tools that you need to make your community really thrive? And there's some very obvious examples of communities that have figured some of this out. We think that there's some lessons that can be learned, but we feel that chief among that, if you look at the communities that have really figured out how to have distinct local culture, how to turn that into an economic driver for their community, how to make that a big part of their local identity and really who they are, particularly in the music scene, you know, one of the major themes is radio, access to radio. Great local music scenes have access to local radio. The challenge, we think, for the FCC and the Congress and policymakers moving ahead, and for this community of people who care deeply about music and care deeply about radio, is to figure out what are those themes and how do we balance the obligations of the marketplace and what should happen without government's involvement, but also the role that the government needs to play in terms of oversight to try to make sure these things happen. Thank you so much for your great questions and listening this morning. Thanks to the panel, and we're going to take a quick break and come back with broadband.